The Great Dane looks like a monument that learned how to breathe, but its silhouette is a lie. For generations we've treated this breed as a single, noble line, a creature of pure certainty. But DNA doesn't admire appearances, it traces the truth. In 2004, a landmark study led by geneticist Heidi Parker and colleagues, published in the journal Science, exposed the first major crack in the Great Dane's origin story, revealing that everything we thought we knew about this noble giant was actually hiding a much messier, complicated history. That matters because the breed had long been wrapped in a simpler story. To look at a Great Dane is to imagine a creature assembled from certainty: the long limbs, the deep chest, the clean lines, the calm force in the face. Everything about it seems designed to make the eye stop and accept the dog as complete. But DNA does not admire appearances. It counts relationships, traces separation, and exposes the roots that breeding history tries to smooth over. What the 2004 comparison made visible was not yet the whole ancestry of the Great Dane, but the first fracture in the old assumption that a breed's look tells the full story of its beginnings. And that fracture opens a harder question. If a Great Dane is already genetically distinguishable in a broad survey of domestic dogs, what exactly was it before people agreed on the name, before kennel standards fixed the shape, before elegance became the word used to explain power? The answer is not a single straight line. It is a long corridor of crossings, choices, and lost alternatives. Somewhere behind the modern Great Dane, older working dogs were being kept, favored, narrowed, and redirected by human hands. Not because anyone set out to create a myth, but because every generation of breeders selected for something visible and useful, while everything else receded out of sight. The Great Dane stands before you with the confidence of a finished sculpture, yet its genetics suggest a much more complex history. The body you see is the last page of a story that began much earlier, in a world where large dogs were valued for force, steadiness, and presence. The modern shape is only the surface. Beneath it is a history made from pressure, preference, and preservation, the kind that leaves no obvious scar, but changes everything anyway. The 2004 science study did not tell the entire tale, but it did something more important at the start. It made the Great Dane impossible to mistake for a simple invention. It showed that even among many breeds created in the last few centuries, the Great Dane carried a genetic signature that stood apart. Not random, not generic, not a decorative giant borrowed from nowhere. Something had been conserved, refined, and carried forward with enough consistency that science could still read the pattern. So the real puzzle is not whether the Great Dane has history. It is why that history is so much deeper than the image most people hold in their minds. If a dog can look like elegance made visible and still be the product of hidden layers, then the breed becomes more than a pet, more than a show animal, more than a familiar giant at the end of a leash. It becomes evidence that identity can appear simple from a distance and become complicated the moment you look closely enough. And that is where this story begins to turn. Because once the Great Dane is no longer seen as a breed with a neat origin, every part of its presence changes meaning. The size, the calmness, the authority in its posture, even the strange feeling that it seems older than the modern labels attached to it. The DNA does not erase the breed's beauty. It gives that beauty a shadow. It suggests that what looks refined may have been built through repeated acts of selection over a much longer, messier road than anyone likes to admit. If you think that is where the trail ends, stay with it. The deeper question is not just how the Great Dane became so distinctive, but what had to be gathered, mixed, and preserved to make that distinction possible in the first place. Before the DNA ever enters the picture, the familiar story points somewhere very specific: Germany. There, the Great Dane was shaped from medieval dogs built for work first and beauty later, animals used to hunt bears, boars, and deer, and to stand watch as guard dogs for the German nobility. That version feels clean. It gives the giant dog a clear birthplace, a clear purpose, and a clear path from forest to estate. For generations, that was enough. Look closely, though, and the simplicity starts to fray. A dog bred to face a boar does not emerge by accident, and a dog trusted beside noble houses does not stay unchanged for long. Selection pushes hard on the body. It sharpens what is useful, softens what is troublesome, and leaves behind a visible signature that seems obvious only after the fact. That is why the Great Dane can feel so settled in the imagination while carrying so much movement in its background. The elegant outline, the long limbs, the controlled presence. Those are the final notes in a much older score. The classic origin story explains the environment, but it fails to identify the full cast. Hunting dogs, guardians, aristocratic preference, all of that describes the pressure around the animal, not the deeper mixture inside it. And once the first genetic studies of dog diversity began to separate recent breeds from one another, the old idea of a single, tidy origin became harder to defend. In a widely cited science study of 85 dog breeds, including the Great Dane, researchers showed how distinct many recently formed breeds were in genetic terms. That mattered because it revealed a dog could appear self-contained on the surface and still be carrying a longer, more layered inheritance underneath. The problem is that the classic origin story explains the setting, but not the full cast. Hunting dogs, guardians, aristocratic preference, all of that describes the pressure around the animal, not the deeper mixture inside it. And once the first genetic studies of dog diversity began to separate recent breeds from one another, the old idea of a single, tidy origin became harder to defend. In a widely cited science study of 85 dog breeds, including the Great Dane, researchers showed how distinct many recently formed breeds were in genetic terms. That mattered because it revealed a dog could appear self-contained on the surface and still be carrying a longer, more layered inheritance underneath. So the German story remains true, but only as the visible chapter. It tells us where humans sharpened the form, not where every piece of that form first came from. It tells us what people wanted the dog to do, not everything the bloodline had already gathered before the breed was standardized. And that gap is where the real tension begins to build. If the Great Dane was guided by hunters, nobles, and breeders across time, then the question is no longer whether Germany shaped it. The question is, what was already there for Germany to shape? Stay with that question, because the answer does not diminish the dog. It deepens it. Once the old certainty begins to crack, the breed stops looking like a single finished idea and starts looking like a record of choices, crossings, and inheritances that kept surviving because they were useful. That is where the next layer opens, and it is far less straightforward than the name most people know. That towering silhouette carried a hidden weakness all along. The Great Dane stands beside the Irish Wolfhound as one of the two largest dog breeds in the world, and on the surface that scale suggests durability, even dominance. But size can fool the eye. In 2005, a study published in Acta Veterinaria Scandinavica using Swedish insurance records found that 83% of Great Danes died before reaching 10 years old, while the broader average for dogs that died before 10 was 35%. The numbers sit there like a crack running through polished stone, immense frame, elegant outline, shortened span. This is where the comfortable story begins to give way. A breed built to look noble should have seemed built for endurance too, yet the evidence points in the opposite direction. The Great Dane's body carries the marks of intense human selection, not the quiet logic of a self-adjusting form. People kept pushing the same traits higher and tighter. Height, length, presence, a smooth and impressive outline. What survived was a shape that commanded a room, but also one that appears to have been carried far beyond ordinary canine balance. That matters because the lifespan data changes the emotional center of the breed. Suddenly the grandeur is no longer only grandeur, it becomes a kind of fragile achievement, something made by intention and maintained by preference, even when the cost was hidden in the years the dog would never get to live. The Great Dane was admired as if its size proved strength, yet the record from Sweden suggests the opposite lesson. A body can be enlarged until it looks complete, while still paying for that enlargement in silence. And that is the first real fracture in the origin story. If a breed is both one of the biggest dogs on earth and one that often loses years earlier than expected, then its history cannot be read as a simple march toward perfection. It must be read as a series of decisions. Selection kept favoring the visible qualities people loved, while the invisible trade-offs were absorbed into the breed itself. The result is a dog that seems almost ceremonial in profile and unexpectedly vulnerable in time. Listen closely to what that implies. The Great Dane did not emerge from a neutral process that happened to produce beauty. It was shaped under pressure, narrowed by taste, and stabilized by repetition. Its size was amplified, its outline refined, and its role as a striking companion was preserved because humans kept choosing it. But a selection path that rewards appearance so strongly can also leave a quiet debt inside the body. The short life expectancy is not a side note. It is a clue. It tells us that what looks most effortless may have been bought with the hardest bargain. Stay with that thought, because it reorders the whole breed in a more unsettling way. The Great Dane's imposing look no longer signals simple vigor. It signals a history of emphasis, a long insistence on one kind of dog at the expense of another. And once that becomes visible, the next question is unavoidable. If the surface was shaped so aggressively, what else in the ancestry was being pulled, blended, and preserved beneath it? In 2008, research led by Dr. Lee Ann Clark, published in the journal Gene, finally mapped this pattern. In the Great Dane, the Harlequin coat was not just a dramatic patchwork of black and white. A study published in Gene mapped the Harlequin locus to chromosome 9, tying one of the breed's most iconic features to a specific genetic region. What looked like artistry on the surface turned out to be an address in DNA. That matters because the Harlequin pattern is more than decoration. It is one of the visual signatures that made the Great Dane instantly recognizable in show rings, photographs, and memory itself. For generations, people looked at that coat and saw elegance, rarity, even a kind of aristocratic confidence. But the 2008 finding gave the pattern a different weight. It showed that the breed's identity could be traced not only through size, not only through history, but through a marker precise enough to be mapped on a chromosome. Listen to the shift inside that discovery. When a trait as distinctive as Harlequin can be localized, the breed stops feeling like a single block of inherited mystery. It becomes readable in layers. One layer is the body people admire, another is the genetic architecture underneath, where appearance is assembled from pieces that can be followed, compared, and studied. The Great Dane's elegance was never floating free of biology. It was anchored there, and that anchor changes the story in a quieter, more unsettling way. A breed can look unified while carrying a complicated internal record of what was preserved, intensified, or narrowed across time. The Harlequin locus does not explain the whole Great Dane, but it proves that the breed's identity is not merely an impression formed by scale and posture. It is encoded, at least in part, as a map of traits that can be found, named, and linked to a particular stretch of the genome. That is why chromosome 9 becomes more than a technical detail. It becomes a turning point. The breed's famous coat is no longer just a visual event. It is evidence that the Great Dane story is written in inheritable markers that survived selection and repetition. A dog that once seemed defined by grandeur alone now appears as a living record of genetic choices made across time. And the deeper implication is harder to ignore. If one of the breed's most recognizable signatures can be placed with such precision, then the Great Dane is not a simple monument to size. It is a layered inheritance where beauty, structure, and identity all leave measurable traces. That is the part many people miss when they only see the silhouette. They are looking at the result, not the mechanism. If you want the next layer, stay close, because the real surprise is not just that the Great Dane has a genetic signature. It is that the signature points to a much broader pattern of inheritance, one that reaches beyond a single coat color and asks what else in the breed has been hidden in plain sight. The clue was never only in the coat. Long before the Great Dane became a symbol of height and poise, its genome was already carrying a more complicated story, and a 2021 high-resolution long-read assembly published in PNAS by Wang et al. Made that story impossible to ignore. The study pointed to GC-rich sequences and mobile elements as active contributors to the Great Dane genome, showing that its inheritance is not just a straight line of fixed traits, but a crowded archive where older signals, shifting segments, and regulatory pieces still matter. That matters because a breed like the Great Dane has always invited simplification. People see the outline first, the long neck, the deep chest, the immense frame. But the genome says the outline is only the final arrangement, not the full mechanism. In that PNAS analysis, the interest was not in glamour or myth. It was in sequence composition, in the way certain regions of DNA are structured, and in how those structures help explain why a modern breed can feel so distinct while still resting on layers of shared canine history. The Great Dane, in other words, is not genetically neat. It is organized complexity, and that fits the broader picture described in a 2017 review in Nature Reviews Genetics, which placed dog breeds inside a larger history of demographic change and functional diversity. The point was not that every breed followed the same path. The point was that modern breeds were assembled through population shifts, selection, and repeated sorting, all of it leaving traces in the genome. Seen through that lens, the Great Dane stops being a closed story. It becomes part of a much wider canine record, where ancestry is mixed, refined, and redistributed over time, rather than sealed into a single origin. That is the part many owners never hear. They are told about elegance, loyalty, and the breed's imposing presence. They are not always told that much of what makes a Great Dane lives below what can be seen. Mobile elements can reshape nearby genetic activity. GC-rich stretches can influence how DNA behaves and is read. Together, those details suggest a genome that has not merely been preserved, but actively organized through layers of change. The breed's identity is not frozen in a heroic pose. It is a working genetic system, still carrying echoes of the processes that formed it. Once you see that, the old idea of a simple purebred line starts to weaken. A Great Dane can be registered, recognized, and standardized, and still remain the product of a deep and uneven past. The animal in the room is large, calm, and unmistakable, but the molecular record underneath is busier than the silhouette suggests. That contrast is what makes the breed so revealing. It looks like certainty, yet it is built from movement. So the real shift is not just that science found more detail, it is that the detail changed the meaning of the dog itself. The Great Dane is not proof of a single perfected ancestry. It is proof that perfection in breeding often comes from arrangement rather than purity. If you want to keep following that trail, stay with it, because the final layer is not about size at all. It is about what kind of history a body can hold without ever speaking it aloud. It was easy to imagine the Great Dane as a finished answer until the breed was opened from the inside. Then the picture changed again. In 2022, the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory at UC Davis looked at 121 registered Great Danes from several countries and found almost every allele present across 33 STR loci and 7 DLA class Y and Thusenu regions. That is not the profile of a narrow, sealed line. It is the sign of a breed carrying a surprisingly broad genetic reservoir beneath its formal identity. This matters because the breed had already been described as layered, mixed, and historically assembled. But internal diversity adds a different kind of depth. A dog can look uniform in the ring and still hold a wide range of inherited variation in the blood. The Great Dane does not become less coherent because of that. It becomes more interesting. Coherence here is not sameness. It is the result of a population that still remembers many branches of its past. The DLA findings sharpened that idea even further. Among those immune region markers, the laboratory reported unique alleles in DLA class Y, pointing to a distinct founder influence within the breed. In plain terms, the Great Dane seems to carry a genetic signature that did not emerge from a single clean source, but from a lineage that left a strong mark early on and never fully disappeared. That kind of signal changes the meaning of the dog's apparent stability. The steadiness people admire may actually rest on older variation that breeding never completely erased. And that opens a more intimate question. If a Great Dane can remain recognizable while preserving so much internal diversity, then what exactly are we looking at when we call a breed pure? Not purity in the fragile sense of isolation, but continuity under pressure. Not a line without crossings, but a line that survived them. That is why this breed feels larger than its frame. The giant body is only the surface. Underneath, the record is busy, resilient, and far from empty. The dog standing beside a family, a field, or a show ring is not just the product of selection from the past. It is also a vessel for variation still alive now, carried forward in markers most people never see. So the final surprise is not that the Great Dane is mixed. That was already clear. The surprise is that the breed remains genetically broad even after generations of standardization. The form was narrowed. The inheritance was not. If you want a deeper look at how hidden histories keep shaping what we think we know, stay with the story. The most revealing part of a breed is sometimes the part that refuses to disappear. What makes the Great Dane so striking is not just its size, but the way that size carries a hidden cost. The same breed that still looks so composed beside a doorway, so dignified in a yard, so unmistakably Great Dane in silhouette, is also living with a thinner margin of time than many people assume. And that is where the story stops being only about ancestry and becomes something more personal. At the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory at the University of California, Davis, the breed is not treated as a relic of the past. It is handled as a living population that still needs guidance. The lab offers Great Dane DNA tests for paternity and genetic diversity, giving breeders tools to track how closely dogs are related and how much variation remains inside a line. That matters because a breed can look stable on the outside while losing room to maneuver on the inside. UC Davis turns invisible inheritance into something breeders can actually work with, one sample at a time. That kind of testing changes the meaning of every mating choice. A pair of dogs may both meet the standard, both carry the same elegant frame, both seem ideal under show lights, and yet their genetic relationship can quietly narrow the future of the line. Testing does not erase the breed's history. It exposes the responsibilities left behind by that history. The Great Dane is not only a monument to selection, it is also a breed that has to be managed with precision if its health is going to keep pace with its image. The pressure becomes clearer when lifespan enters the picture. A 2024 study in the United Kingdom, summarized in Wikipedia, reported a mean life expectancy of 10.6 years for the Great Dane. For comparison, the same source gives 12.7 years for purebred dogs overall and 12 years for mixed-breed dogs. The numbers are plain, and they are hard to ignore. The breed that people often describe with words like noble, gentle, or majestic is also one of the breeds that has less time than many others to remain in a family's life. That contradiction matters because it changes how the earlier DNA story should be read. Diversity is not a guarantee. Ancient mixing, selective breeding, and preserved variation can explain how a Great Dane came into being, but they do not automatically protect it from the consequences of intense breeding over generations. A broad inheritance can survive in the background, while the body still carries risk in the foreground. In other words, the past can remain rich even when the present is fragile. So the deeper question is no longer where the Great Dane came from. It is how much of that inherited breadth can still be used to protect the dog now. The answer is partly hidden in laboratories, partly in kennels, and partly in the decisions people make when they choose not just beauty, but balance. The breed's future depends on that choice more than most owners ever see. If you care about dogs that carry both history and vulnerability in the same body, stay with this story. The next layer is not about appearance at all. It is about what happens when a breed becomes famous for one thing and is quietly measured by another. And then a single dog made the whole argument impossible to ignore. In 2014, a Great Dane named Zeus was recognized as the tallest dog in the world, standing 111.8 centimeters at the withers before his death. The number is striking, but what it really does is give a body to the story that genetics had already begun to tell. Zeus was not a curiosity floating outside the breed's history. He was its silhouette pushed to an extreme, a living measure of how far selection could stretch a lineage without breaking it. That image matters because it turns an abstract conclusion into something you can almost see. The Great Dane does not become remarkable only because it is big. It becomes remarkable because that size is the visible edge of a long inheritance, one shaped by ancient mixing, repeated refinement, and the stubborn human desire to keep amplifying a trait until it feels almost mythical. Zeus stood at the far end of that process, but he did not invent it. He revealed it. And in that reveal, the breed looks different, not simpler, not more easily explained, just more honest. The Great Dane is not a single note played louder than the rest of the canine world. It is a chord built over time, with older lines preserved beneath the surface, and selective breeding pressing certain features into the spotlight. The result is a dog whose appearance seems immediate, even obvious, while its biological story is anything but. That is why the breed's identity cannot be reduced to elegance, scale, or aristocratic presence alone. Those things are real, but they are only the surface. Underneath them is a history of working dogs, human preference, shifting standards, and genetic layers that were never meant to be visible all at once. DNA did not erase the Great Dane's legend. It made the legend harder to misunderstand. It showed that the grandeur people admired was not a disguise over nature, but nature and intention braided together so tightly that one could no longer be separated from the other. Zeus gives that truth a face. When people saw him, they saw a record. But what the record really displayed was continuity, a breed carrying its past in its bones, in its proportions. in the way even a single individual can seem to concentrate centuries into one frame. That is the quieter power of the Great Dane story. It does not end with proof of size. It ends with a deeper recognition that identity in animals, like identity in people, is rarely pure, rarely simple, and almost never built from one origin alone. So the final lesson is not that the Great Dane was misnamed or misunderstood in a trivial way. It is that every confident story about origin deserves a second look, especially when biology is involved. What appears fixed may be layered, what appears singular may be assembled, and what appears majestic from a distance may, on closer view, be the result of countless decisions, pressures, and inheritances working together across generations. That is why Zeus matters beyond the record books. He is not just the tallest Great Dane ever documented. He is the breed's argument made visible, a living reminder that its true ancestry was never narrow enough for a simple legend. If this kind of discovery stays with you, look again at the dogs around you. The bodies you think you understand may be carrying older histories than their faces will ever show.